In the 18 and 1900s, the British were involved in many expeditions, the North and South Poles, and the most disastrous, the Northwest Passage. In the 1920s, Britain had her eye on Mt Everest, the highest mountain above sea level, 29,029 feet, or 8,848 meters. There was the 1921 reconnaissance expedition. The goal was to search for routes and to see if it was even possible to climb, and if possible, attempt to climb to the top. George Mallory, Edward Wheeler, and Guy Bullock reached the North Pole, but were forced to return. In 1922, another expedition set off to reach the summit using the same route, the Rongbuk Glacier, and the North Pole, to the North Ridge and the Northeast Ridge, and then the summit. This was the first expedition to use bottled oxygen. On this expedition, 3 attempts were made for the summit, and the last ended in disaster. 7 porters died in an avalanche. This was the first climbing death on Mt Everest. And now to the most famous 1924 Mt Everest Expedition. Bottled oxygen was brought in again, but it was not reliable. The members of the expedition included Charles Bruce, head of the expedition, Edward Norton, deputy head of expedition and mountaineer, George Mallory, mountaineer, Bentley Beatham, mountaineer, Jeffrey Bruce, mountaineer, John DeVars Hazard, mountaineer, R.W.G. Hensington, expedition doctor, Andrew Irving, mountaineer, John Knoll, photographer, movie camera operator, Noel Odell, mountaineer geologist, E.O. Shabreri, transportation officer and interpreter, Dr. T. Howard Somerville, mountaineer. 60 porters were also hired for the expedition, and this is the first time that they would actually use porters up the mountain in a significant way. The locals were adapted to high altitude, and they were indeed strong climbers. The expedition was financed and organized by the Royal Geographical Society, Alpine Club, and John Knoll, the photographer for the expedition. He purchased all photograph rights for the expedition. Back in those days, if you wanted to climb Everest, you had to try it from the north side. Nepal was a country that forbid Westerners in those days. Tibet was the only option. It was a long and difficult journey to just even get to the mountain. You had to time the trip in between the end of winter and the start of the monsoon seasons. In February, a few of the expedition leaders and climbers arrived early to hire the porters as well as Karma Paul as a translator. The porters earned a shilling a day. They also gathered all the gear and got their rations ready. The rest of the expedition arrived in March, and the expedition headed off towards Mt Everest. It was a long and hazardous trip in those days. The leader, Charles Bruce, got malaria on the journey. On April 28th, they finally reached the Rongbuk Monastery, where they usually met with the Lama and performed ceremonies, but the Lama was sick, so the next day they headed off and reached Everest Base Camp. The weather was very cold and it was snowing. The planned route to the summit that Mallory had found in 1921 was the glacier to the North Pole, the North Ridge, and northeast after that, the first, second, and third step, and then on to the summit. No one had climbed the second step before in 1924. A 30-foot cliff, which the last 16 feet were vertical. A ladder is there today, but in 1924, the climbers had to figure it out when they got there. The expedition set up 4 camps at first. Camp 1 was at 5,400 meters, Camp 2 at 6,000 meters, Camp 3 at 6,400 meters, and Camp 4 at 7,000 meters. The porters carried the supplies, food, and oxygen up to the camps. They finished in early May, then the weather turned for the worse. On May 19th, climbers Norton, Mallory, and Somerville and Odell reached Camp 3 and began the task of fixing ropes and setting up Camp 4. It began to snow and the winds picked up again. Mountaineer Hazard was at Camp 4 with 12 porters. He safely got 8 porters down, but 4 were left back up at Camp 4. They were sick. Mallory, Norton, and Somerville rescued the sick men. The first summit attempt would take place on June 1st without bottled oxygen. It was George Mallory and Jeffrey Bruce, and 9 porters set off to reach Camp 4, which was below the North Pole. The team set off to set up Camp 5, but some of the porters abandoned the group and dropped the loads that they were carrying. The rest reached 25,200 feet and set up Camp 5, then went back for the supplies that were left. The plan was to set up Camp 6 and then go for the summit, but the day after they set up Camp 5, more porters refused to go any further, and the first summit attempt was abandoned before it had even started. The second summit attempt had actually started their climb the day after Mallory and Bruce started, again with no bottled oxygen. Edward Norton and Howard Somerville, the first team, passed the second set of climbers and 6 porters on their retreat down the mountain. They hoped that their porters would not turn back on them. They reached Camp 5 with now 4 porters. The next day, Camp 6 was made at 26,800 feet. The porters went down to Camp 4, but the climbers stayed, and they would attempt the summit the next day. They awoke and started late at 6:40 a.m. on June 4th. They climbed until 12 o'clock when Somerville turned around. Norton went on by himself. He climbed and climbed, reaching over 28,000 feet. He stopped 920 feet from the summit. The terrain was getting too steep for him, and he was questioning himself. He climbed down to Somerville, and then they headed down at 2 p.m. On the way down, Somerville had a problem. Later, he described it like there was a blockage in his throat, the lining. He thought he was going to die, but he eventually got it out, and then he continued down. They made it down to Camp 4 using flashlights. In 1924, flashlights were nowhere near as bright as the LED lights of today, just a dull, small beam. They met Mallory at Camp 4, and Mallory spoke with Norton about a third summit attempt with Andrew Irving. He agreed, and then they all slept for the night. Norton began getting headaches, and by morning time he was snowblind. He stayed there until June 6th, when porters carried him down. Irving was a young, blonde-haired 22-year-old, but he was strong and very knowledgeable with bottled oxygen. He was not an experienced climber like Mallory, but Mallory had gotten to know the young man on the boat ride to India. Mallory was 37 years old. He had a wife, Ruth Mallory, and 3 kids at home. The same day Norton was walked down to safety, George and Andrew left Camp 4 for Camp 5 with 8 porters. They had bottled oxygen with them for their summit attempt, 2 bottles each. The men carried 25 pounds of gear. The last picture of the 2 men was taken by Odell as they geared up and then headed up. Some of the porters returned with a note from Mallory that afternoon. It said, "There is no wind here and things look hopeful." Odell went to Camp 5 as support. The rest of the porters came down with a message from Mallory. "Dear Odell, we're awfully sorry to have left things in such a mess. Our Una cooker rolled down the slope at the last moment. Be sure of getting back 4 tomorrow in time to evacuate before dark as I hoped to. In the tent, I must have left a compass. For the Lord's sake, rescue it. We are without. To here on 90 atmospheres for 2 days, so we'll probably go on 2 cylinders, but it's a bloody load for climbing. Perfect weather for the job. Yours ever, G. Mallory." On June 8th at 12:50 a.m., a mist that was blocking Odell's view of the mountain cleared, and he saw what he believed was Mallory and Irving on the ridge nearing the base of the final pyramid. He believed Mallory and Irving reached the second step, but were behind schedule. The clouds rolled in and covered his view after this. Odell headed up to Camp 6 and reached it at 2 p.m. when a storm rolled in. He yelled and whistled for Mallory and Irving, but he heard nothing in response. The storm ended 2 hours later, but he still could not see Mallory or Irving. Odell headed for Camp 5. No sign of Mallory or Irving was seen that night or the next day. Odell climbed to 8,200 meters, but saw nothing. The expedition left Mount Everest on June 11th. Nothing was known about the two missing men except for what Odell saw high up on the mountain, and it stayed that way for 9 years. It wasn't until the 1933 British Mt Everest Expedition when an ice axe was found 250 yards east of the first step and 60 feet below. Percy Wynne Harris, the man who found the axe, said it was a 30-degree slab of rock with loose pebbles. It was believed at the time that this was the spot where there was an accident, since no climber would abandon their ice axe given its importance. This was the only evidence found on the mountain of Mallory or Irving until 1975, when a Chinese climber told a Japanese climber that there was a dead English climber at 8,100 meters, and he pointed up the mountain, an area which was directly below where the ice axe was found. Eric Simonson led an expedition in 1999. Eric saw old oxygen bottles on his first descent up Everest at the first step. They found one of Mallory and Irving's oxygen bottles in 1999. They also reproduced Odell's position in 1924 and tested to see if Mallory and Irving could have been seen. They could see all 3 of the steps on Everest from that position. Following all the evidence that was previously found since Mallory and Irving disappeared in 1924, the 1999 team finally found one of the missing mountaineers after spotting a patch of white in the rocks in the search area. George Mallory's mummified body was found at 8,159 meters, the same height that the Chinese climber claimed to have seen a dead British climber. George Mallory had rope marks on his skin around his waist, and his right foot was almost broken off. His forehead had a large wound. He was found with no oxygen bottles nearby. The body had a pair of old hobnail climbing boots. He had a pair of snow goggles in his vest, and the tag on his shirt had the name George Mallory. A letter addressed to him was in his pocket, and a wristwatch. His camera was not found. George Mallory had also carried a photograph of his wife in his pocket, and his plan was to leave it at the summit. This photograph was not found on his remains. Many believe that this photo was indeed proof that he summited, and he left the photo on the summit, and the fall happened on the descent, but his body was open to the elements for 75 years. The paper with him was still intact, but it is possible that the photo could have blown away or been buried under the rocks. Unfortunately, no proof was found that Mallory or Irving made it to the summit that day in 1924. They could have made it to the first step and ran out of oxygen, then dumped the bottles, and then had their accident. Or they could have made it all the way up and had an accident on the descent. But the truth is, we will never know unless by some chance Irving is found with evidence that they made it to the summit. At the time of this video, we are a few months away from the 100-year anniversary of the death of George Mallory and Andrew Irving. George has been found, but Andrew is still out there somewhere. I hope you enjoyed this video, folks. I've also been fascinated with Mount Everest since I was a kid. Reading about the 1996 Everest accident, I guess you'll call it, the Mount Everest disaster. Fascinated by that as a kid. There's just something about it. Mount Everest is fascinating. History's fascinating. You put the two together, you got a great story. I hope you enjoyed, folks, and we will see you on the next. Peace!